Hello everyone and welcome to another ride overview. Today we are going to discuss the somewhat unorthodox water coaster. This ride is mostly a fairly normal roller coaster, but every now and then there will be a big splashdown element similar to the splash boats. This makes it kind of a combination between a roller coaster and a water ride, and in the original games it is actually listed in both categories along with the dinghy slide. I would say it's more of a roller coaster though, as that is mostly how it behaves. The water coaster uses the same track style as the junior coaster, and similarly it is quite basic in terms of what it can do. It does have steep slopes, which is very nice, but there are no steep turns, no banked sloped turns and no exciting special elements. It doesn't even have access to the photo section, although RCT2 did add that, and it also added boosters to the water coaster, making it a little bit more versatile. Of course, the coaster ride isn't really the point of the water coaster, as the main selling point is the water splash. This is not a separate special element, but rather a toggle that you can enable when building track pieces. That makes it sound like you can just turn this on and off whenever, but it's actually rather limited. Only level straight pieces and medium turns can be turned into water. These water sections use the same track style as the splash boats, and when you realize that, it makes a lot of sense that only medium turns can be water, as the splash boats only has medium turns available. That means they could do this without needing to create any extra track sprites, saving them some effort. Still though, it would have been really nice to have the other turns and the diagonal track pieces as well. Maybe that's something that RCT2 can do in the future. They have been adding new track pieces to a variety of rides, so who knows. The splashdown elements are a lot of fun, but the downside is that it takes all the speed out of the ride. Got a big drop into a massive, epic water splash? Well, now you're gonna need another chain lift to get you back up again. And the worst thing is that while they look cool, they don't even give any stats or anything. Apart from needing one water piece to prevent a massive stat penalty, you have no benefit from including them. In fact, because they slow down the vehicle so much, they lower the average speed and increase the ride duration, which in turn lowers the throughput. This doesn't really matter in pay-for-entry parks, but when guests pay for the ride, you want the throughput to be as high as possible to make as much money as possible. Here I have a water coaster with a splashdown element halfway through and another one near the end. After 31 years of operation, it has processed 50,000 guests. In the same time, this alternate version with the splashdowns removed, save for one piece at the very end, has processed 55,000 guests, 10% more. That's not a massive difference, so it's not something you have to worry too much about, but it does show that including water sections will not benefit you if you're trying to make money. However, they are useful as an infallible brake piece. If you have a water section before entering the station, then a crash due to a brakes failure becomes impossible. The brakes can still fail, of course, it does not prevent the breakdown from happening, but the cars will be entering the station so slowly that collisions are for once not deadly. That is a nice use case, although you can achieve the same by putting a block brake piece right before the station. Even if the ride is not in block section mode, block brakes will never fail, so this too will prevent a crash during a brakes failure. A water section does look a lot nicer though, and that's worth something too. I really like the concept of the water coaster, the idea of it, but unfortunately if you look at the stats and how much money it can make, it's just not very good. The excitement rating is actually quite decent, with the average sized Splashtastic pre-built reaching a rating of about 5.6. The problem is that this also comes with an intensity rating of 5.7 and a nausea rating of 4.1. Those are not crazy high, but they're definitely higher than quite a few other coaster types would have for a design like this. That does unfortunately mean that you will need more handymen to clean up the extra puke that this generates. Not on the same level as something like a multi-dimension coaster, no, not even close, but more than say a looping coaster. Another downside is the vehicle type, which is just a singular boat that has a capacity for only 6 guests. This isn't great, and it has 2 significant consequences. The first is that it's quite light, which means that it will lose speed rather quickly. In this comparison between the water and the looping coaster, you can see the looping coaster train pull ahead more and more until it crashes because I couldn't be bothered to finish the track. This means lower stats, longer ride times and more cases where you think it should make a hill but it doesn't because it loses speed quicker than you are used to. The second downside of having singular vehicles is the throughput. One train, or boat I guess, can only fit 6 guests, and then it has to depart and make space for the next boat to allow the next guests in line to go on the ride. This frequent departing slows everything down and leads to lower throughputs. The absolute highest you can get, where there is constantly a boat ready, is nearly 3,000 guests per hour, which is about half of what you can get on rides like the looping coaster and wooden coaster. This design is deliberately extremely optimized though, with a very long station and a very short actual ride. A more realistic, somewhat long design like the one in Sunny Swamps will not even reach 1,000 guests an hour. One I built, which is not nearly as long, reaches about 1,450 guests an hour, which is better, but still not great for a roller coaster. As a comparison, this very long hypercoaster from Blackpool Pleasure Beach can reach about double the throughput of my much shorter water coaster, with nearly 3,000 guests an hour. You can do a bit better on very long rides if you include a ton of block brake sections, but that also requires a lot of deliberate optimizing. The 3 pre-built designs all employ this strategy, and they don't go over 1,000 guests per hour either. The expansions do provide the water coaster with 3 extra vehicle types: the manta ray, the trilobite and the flying boat. These are almost identical. They also have 6 seats, have the same weight of 950 and give the same stats. The only difference is the size of the vehicle. Both the standard boats and the manta ray boats can fit 9 vehicles on a 12-tile station, but the flying boats can fit just 8 and the trilobites even only 7, lowering the throughput even more. Having singular vehicles is not inherently a problem. The wild mouse coaster types all have that and they are fantastic, but they also fully take advantage of it. They have, for example, tiny turns that allow them to be very compact, and they also get very high stats for how small they are. The water coaster has none of that and is what I would call a big coaster type, whereas the wild mice and co are small coaster types. This makes the water coaster have all the downsides of singular vehicles with none of the upsides, and that makes it very mediocre. It is quite cheap though, as the cost of its track pieces is less than 2/3 of the looping coaster, which already isn't too expensive. This makes it similar in cost to the junior coaster when you build one, except that it cannot make you nearly enough money in return if you're charging for the rides. If you're charging for the park entry, then throughput and stats don't matter much, and this becomes quite a decent ride because it's cheap, unique and fun to build. And even if you do charge for the rides, it's certainly not bad. Yes, it's not a good roller coaster, but roller coasters are overpowered, so it's still much better than something like a haunted house or a go-kart, and it will absolutely serve you well if you don't have any better options or if you just like building water coasters. Like all roller coasters, the water coaster has certain stat requirements that it needs to fulfill in order to prevent heavy penalties to its excitement, intensity and nausea ratings. They are not very demanding though, and you can reach them very easily. It needs to have a drop of at least 6 meters, it needs to have at least 1 drop, and it needs to have a top speed of at least 25 km an hour. For each of these requirements that it fails to make, all its stats get divided by 2. Oh, and then there is the special extra requirement of having at least 1 water track piece. It is a water coaster after all. If you don't have this, your intensity and nausea ratings will be unaffected, but the excitement will be divided by 8. That is an incredibly harsh punishment, so you definitely do not want to forget this. Here we can also see that I lied about the water sections not providing any extra stats, because the one with the singular water track piece has a higher intensity and nausea rating. The thing is that only the first water splash element gives these stats, and making that element longer or including more than 1 section doesn't give anything more. So yeah, while technically it gives stats about 0.2 excitement and 0.15 intensity and nausea, past that 1 singular tile that you will always include anyway, you don't get anything extra, so in practice they don't provide anything. I totally planned this bit about revealing that they technically do give stats, by the way. It's absolutely not the case that I recorded the footage for the excitement penalty and then panicked and added this bit in because I suddenly realized that the intensity and nausea stats were not identical. No, not at all. It's now time for me to show you some effective designs. First up is always the tiniest design that passes all the stat requirements. It really is very small, as the water coaster does not have high requirements. It has low stats and only 2 boats, but because it is so short, it still has quite an impressive throughput with about 1650 guests an hour. This will absolutely not fail you if you need some microcoasters to get more guests, increase the park entry fee, increase the park value, or just make a lot of money from ride income. With the construction price of just €802, it's actually quite a good microcoaster. It's very cheap, quite small, and has a surprisingly high throughput. To get this design and the others, you can click the link in the description. Up next is a bigger design that costs a little bit over €3,000. This is for when using microcoasters feels too much like cheating, which I can understand, but you still want something good and compact. Unfortunately, it does not make use of the unique water aspect of the water coaster, apart from that single tile to prevent the excitement rating from pretty much vanishing entirely. These designs are made to be as efficient as possible, and the water sections only hamper that goal, which is why I'm not including them. With a longer station, this design almost has enough boats to always have one ready, and it reaches quite a good throughput of about 2350 guests an hour. One thing you always want to do with your water coaster is put the entrance on the first or second tile. The boats are very small, and if you put the entrance at the back, the guests have to walk a very long way on the platform to the vehicle, slowing down the throughput a lot. This really is important, and to show that I will swap the entrance and exit buildings and see what the difference is. With optimal placement, this ride got to a throughput of 2350 guests an hour, and with this awful placement it's only 1500, less than 2/3 as much. So yeah, take this into account. Having it 1 or 2 tiles away from the front is not a big deal, but the further away you put it, the worse it gets. This design is not safe in the case of a brakes failure, so you could extend it by 1 tile and put a block brake before the station if you value safety more than I do. The third and final design goes in a slightly different direction. It is only slightly longer and more expensive than the previous design, but it has a much higher intensity rating. This is achieved by intentionally making it go too fast through an unbanked small turn and getting excessive lateral G-forces. This gives a bunch of intensity and nausea as a penalty, but this penalty can also be rather useful. Firstly, this design now works in parks where the guests prefer more intense rides, as the previous one is not intense enough for that, but this one is. The second advantage is that you can now charge more for it, as all its stats contribute to the ride ticket price and also to the park value it provides. It's not a lot more, as we can charge up to €12.4 for this one in this setup versus 11.2 for the previous design, but it's still something. Here I also had space for a block brake, so it will be safe in the case of a brakes failure. With its 12 tile station, it can reach the maximum possible throughput of 2900 guests per hour, but only if you disable the minimum waiting time, which by default is set to 10 seconds. Disabling this is very important on these kinds of rides with lots of small vehicles. If you don't disable it, then the maximum throughput falls from 2900 guests to just 1600, so don't forget it. Going much larger than this for an optimized pre-built design is not really useful on the water coaster, as that's not what it's for. Longer designs can work very well on the water coaster, but those tend to be not very compact and well decorated, so in other words custom built. And that is the water coaster. It's a fun coaster type with a unique gimmick that is unfortunately not very useful, but can be fun to play with. Because of the way this coaster type is, it has a lot of the downsides of a single car train with unfortunately none of the upsides, which makes it very mediocre. But don't let that deter you from using the water coaster if you like it, because it's still a roller coaster, so it's still a good ride, but also because ultimately fun goes above everything else. If you want to see my previous ride overview and learn all about the boat hire, click right here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you in the next video.